Welcome, coming to you live from Champion Studio in Charleston, South Carolina. It is better than ever live. Wherever you're watching, wherever you're listening, I hope you're making today your masterpiece. My name is Dr. David Geier, orthopedic surgeon, sports medicine specialist, and media medical expert. My goal is to help you feel and perform your best regardless of age, injuries, or medical conditions. Very excited to be here on this Tuesday early afternoon here on the East Coast. If you're out west, I hope you're having a great morning, very productive, hopefully exercising, eating well, all of that kind of good stuff. Just so you know, I have talked about this for the last couple of weeks, but starting on Friday, and I'm going to try to make this a regular feature, even though it might not be every week, but on Friday, this Friday, 3 days from now at noon Eastern Time, I'm doing an extra Better Than Ever Live in which I'm going to answer your questions. Bone and joint injury questions, health questions, wellness questions. As I can't do on this show, it's still not going to be specific medical advice, but I'll at least address topics related to injuries you potentially have. So mark your calendars or subscribe on youtube.com/Dr. David Geier. Click the bell to be notified, and you'll get an alert saying, hey, I'm online at 12 p.m. noon Eastern on Friday. And like I say, I'll try to make that a semi-regular thing. Like I just alluded to, though, on this show, this is not specific medical advice either. I'm not your doctor. You're not my patient. I'd love to be your doctor. You're welcome to come see me at my practice here outside of Charleston, South Carolina, or in Charlotte, North Carolina. But that's not what this show's about. This is about general information, medical information, health information, wellness information, educational purposes only. So please keep that in mind. If you have specific medical questions, medical concerns, please talk to your doctor. All right, a lot to get to today. Let's start with something that I talked about in a recent show last week, and that is salt and sodium. One of the really big culprits in our health and our nutrition especially is really high levels of sodium. The RDA, the recommended daily limit for sodium for all people, according to the Food and Drug Administration, is 2,300 milligrams a day. Now, if you have high blood pressure, which high sodium levels, high salt in your diet is one of the biggest contributing factors to high blood pressure, at least for a lot of people. For people with high blood pressure, the recommended limit is 1,500. Unfortunately, the average American gets about 3,400 milligrams a day, way over the limit of 2,300 milligrams. That may surprise you, it may not. Now, where is that extra sodium, that extra salt coming from? Is it from pouring salt on your food before you eat? Surprisingly, no. 70% of your sodium is in the food before you ever make it. It's in what I keep labeling a really harmful thing. It's in processed foods. We're talking about prepackaged meats. We're talking about canned goods. We're talking about anything that comes in a bag or a box. Any type of sort of pre-processed food, frozen dinners, frozen foods, things like that. 70% of our sodium comes from that. Well, the FDA wants to get sodium under control for the public, so it is asking food makers to voluntarily limit the amount of sodium they put in foods so that over the next 2.5 years, that comes down to 3,000 milligrams a day. Still not anywhere near what's recommended on a daily basis, the 2,300, but at least an improvement. So the first time I thought of that, like, why don't you have them reduce it so that the average intake is 2,300 milligrams? But then I thought about it, and it got me back to that thing I was talking about last time, the Stanford study that showed this, basically this intervention that they got people on. It only brought their blood pressure down just over a point, a millimeter of mercury, but it was estimated to cut hundreds of thousands of heart attacks and strokes. So even a little bit can be beneficial. But again, this is voluntary. You're asking these food companies to put less sodium in their food. Well, you think, well, that's not a big deal. Here's the problem with that. Sodium is critically important to processed foods. It's a preservative. It's what allows those foods to stay on grocery store shelves for so long. It's it has antimicrobial, antiviral, antibacterial properties. So that's why it's used in canned goods, so that those canned goods don't basically get overridden by bacteria and people get really sick. So they're high in sodium. But it's also one of the few ways that food companies, food manufacturers, can make food taste better without piling on calories. Because if you think of all the other things you'd put in it to make it taste better, any kind of sugar, any kind of sweetener, the calories, fat, all that's just going to go way up. And they don't want their nutritional label, instead of showing 200, all of a sudden a serving is 800 calories. So sodium is a great way to do this. Here's another criticism, and somebody in the article I read really condemning this suggested that this is like telling the big tobacco companies back in the day, hey, why don't you voluntarily limit the amount of nicotine in your cigarettes? Well, of course they're not going to do that, because their business model is predicated on getting you addicted to the cigarettes. This is similar in a different way. Maybe the sodium might not be as harmful as nicotine, but they want those potato chips to taste really good, so you keep buying them. They want the processed meats to taste really good, and all of these types of things. So, and again, by being voluntary, there's going to be companies that just say, forget it, we're just not doing this. So it's one of those things that, and here's the other part. They're like, all right, if we do this over 2.5, this is true. The FDA thought, well, if we do this over 2.5 years, we're going to gradually get people used to having the foods not be as salty tasting. They'll gradually notice it less. And I suppose that's true if the companies very gradually took the sodium out there. But again, you're not just getting it in one type of food. You're getting it in all types of processed foods. So I am extremely skeptical. I'm not necessarily opposed to it, especially if it's voluntary, because I feel like if you just made companies do it, they're just going to, the extra costs of whatever they're going to have to do to make those products last longer, that's just going to get passed on to consumers. The products will just be more expensive. I'm just skeptical that this is going to do that much. The solution, albeit I know that people are unlikely to do this, is to just not eat as much processed foods. Cook dinner with meats that you buy at the grocery store that are not in a Ziploc bag type of package. Cook vegetables, make fruits, make real food, legumes and nuts and seeds, and not just things that come in a bag or box. Your sodium will drop dramatically. I'm not as actually worried about the salt shakers as I am is what's made by the food companies to make those foods taste good when they come in a box or in a bag. All right, I'm going to completely change directions real quickly. I read this article last week and I wanted to talk about it briefly, but I'm not going to go into it in tremendous depth because I do have a little bit different perspective than the person that wrote this. This is an article in Forbes, a guy named Prem Ramkumar. I didn't click on his link, but just reading the article, I am guessing that he is a joint replacement orthopedic surgeon, meaning an orthopedic surgeon that focuses on doing hip and knee replacements. And that's huge business these days. Over the next few years, it's expected that 2 million of those procedures will be done every year in the United States. Part of that is the population's getting older, and traditionally we haven't had great treatments, not so much to treat symptoms, but to reverse the broken down cartilage, the broken down bone that lead to arthritis going forward. And so it's basically, cortisone shot, change your lifestyle, and then get a hip or knee replacement when it gets to that point. So this guy writes an article, not so much about the pros and cons of joint replacement, other than he seems to call it the operation of the century. A little bit of bias there, but it has dramatically improved the lives of millions of people. I'm not questioning that. But he's talking about the financing of these surgeries and changes that are being made at the government level, at the CMS level, Center for Medicare and Medicare Services, but then in collaboration with the hospitals and the insurance companies. And basically, the surgeons, and this may be true, I don't do hip and knee replacements. I do sports medicine, so ACLs, rotator cuff repairs, shoulder stabilizations, things through the scope. I don't do joint replacements. But basically what seems to be happening is because so many of these surgeries are going to be needed in the future, the reimbursements to surgeons is getting cut dramatically, much like they've done with eye surgeons, much like they've done with cardiothoracic surgeons and coronary bypass surgeries. So the reimbursement is coming down. In fact, this guy says that very soon a joint replacement will be about the same level of reimbursement as a regular office visit, which is just horrifying to think that you're doing a multi-hour operation, high risk, people, a lot of medical complications, and basically not getting reimbursed much at all. But basically, he says the government has decided to use this comprehensive care for joint replacement, which was proposed by the insurance companies and the hospitals, and not the bundled payments for care initiative that was proposed by the surgeons, which supposedly resulted in twice the savings to the overall healthcare system than the one that was led by the insurance companies and the hospitals. And basically what the plan, again, according to this surgeon, is that it's going to cut the reimbursement to surgeons, but the amount that goes to the hospitals for the hospital stay is actually going up. And I've said all along that with everything in medicine, you look at the studies, you look at decisions made, always follow the money, see where the money is. One of the reasons these surgeries is going up, yes, it is because arthritis is going up, the population's getting older and they're trying to stay more active, but it's also because that's where hospitals make their money. They make their money largely on surgeries, not ERs, not daily office visits, not inpatient stays for COVID, things like that. They get paid most of their money, in a lot of hospitals, it's more than half of their revenue comes from surgeries done at those hospitals, and the hospital stays for surgeries that require you to stay in the hospital. Here is my thing. So I agree with all of this in that it's worrisome, and physicians and surgeons need a seat at the table to help decide some of this to save money to the healthcare system. Because if we're doing millions and millions of these, that's just going to be more and more of our country's GDP that goes to healthcare costs and healthcare spending. I get that. But here's the issue is, this system is broken even ignoring that. I mean, there's too much of an incentive now for surgeons to do joint replacements or nothing else. We get paid for surgeries. An office visit where you just come in, we talk about your arthritis, and that's it. The average orthopedic surgeon, the office visit is somewhere between like 6 and 10 minutes. So you're not going to have a lot of time to talk. And if it's something that leads to surgery, great, you're going to get paid for that surgery. The average office visit pays you almost nothing. And then, so if it needs surgery, that patient, that's great. We'll keep them in the system. If they don't, we need to get them out of the office as soon as possible. And when I say we, again, I don't like this any more than you do, but we get them out of the office and do things like cortisone that make you feel good right then and there, but actually have long-term risks, in a lot of ways make you worse off than you were before, to free up appointment slots for people that do need surgery. So the surgeons, to be fair, are not immune from this either. And that's what's really frustrating about, there's a lot of treatments for arthritis and a lot of these bone and joint conditions that aren't approved by insurance that do work to get things to heal faster and hopefully prevent arthritis. Peptides and PRP and exosomes and stem cells, the jury's still out, and a lot of these are considered experimental. Insurance companies won't pay for them, but yet they seem willing to pay $40,000 or $50,000 for a joint replacement, which again is not necessarily the best thing at preserving your motion and everything else. So I think this whole system has some serious challenges, and as the population gets older, this is going to be more and more of a problem. It'll be interesting to see where this goes, but I can tell you that if the joint replacement surgeons, and again, I am not one, so I don't do those surgeries, but if they're getting paid very little for that, they'll stop doing it. And then what do? They'll just it'll just turn into orthopedics being just, cortisone shots. Because if you're losing money, you can do 6 to 10, joint replacement surgeries a day. You can see 50 people in the office. So if you cut the surgeons too much, they'll just stop doing it. So the whole thing is kind of a mess, quite honestly. Why you're seeing such a rise in functional and integrative medicine and cash-based treatments for all these procedures that insurance calls experimental. Anyway, follow-up study to that along the way of arthritis that kind of goes along with that. So a new study from the CDC, 1/3 of adults in this country with arthritis are not physically active. Now, I get it. It hurts. I'm not saying that it's easy, but our exercise is so good for people with arthritis. It gets the joint moving. It gets, helps the joint lubricate itself by basically moving. If you sit around all day, you get stiff. It hurts. It's this never-ending cycle, this downward spiral of pain and stiffness and problems. But exercise is good, whether it's walking, it's lifting weights. It's all this. Plus, if you do things that are strength-building exercises, yes, you're going to build the strength in the muscles around the knee or around the hip to take pressure off those joints. But muscles are also organs. During physical exercise, strength training, they release what's called myokines, which are, not to get too in the weeds, but they're basically chemicals that nourish cartilage and protect cartilage and would be good with arthritis. So strength training is really good too. But this gets back to why are 1/3 of people not active? 1/3 of people that are with arthritis. And again, it gets back a little bit, not completely, but it gets back to the orthopedic surgeons. It's either surgery or kind of get out of my office, quick fix cortisone. They don't have time to, it's not just saying, they may have time to say, hey, you need to start exercising more, but information doesn't change people's behavior. As much as I love this show, I don't know how many of these people are, ooh, you know what, I'm going to go out and start doing that, like the study I'm about to read about beet juice. I'll tell you about it, but are you actually going to go out and start doing it? We have to change people's behavior, and if you only have 6 to 10 minutes to talk to a patient, you're probably not going to have a long discussion about, all right, how do you start exercising? What do you do on day 1? What do you do on day 2? Send out regular reminders, checking in with them every so often. You just can't do that in the current system, and I think that's partly why people with arthritis aren't exercising, and it's so good for them. Speaking of that, I mentioned this a second ago, beet juice, and to be fair, I've never had beet juice. I've had beets, and they're fine. I don't feel strongly good or bad about beets, and I've really only had them in salads. But beet juice, I've heard this for years, at least 2 or 3 years, about how beet juice could be a really, really good pre-workout drink. And I'm going to start doing more Better Than Ever videos, probably more live videos, and I'm going to do on-location stuff and workouts, nutrition, recovery type things. And one of the things that I've got as an idea is to try beet juice before different workouts and sort of quantify performance, because there is thought that beets might be very good for improving your athletic performance. And it makes sense a little bit because beets are high in what's called nitrates. And in your body, nitrates can be converted to nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator. It opens up the blood vessels, allowing more blood to get through. That's what lowers your blood pressure. But in theory, you deliver more blood to the muscles, better performance. Well, there was a study in the journal Applied Physiology, Nutrition, and Metabolism. They took 14 athletes, and I always get a little concerned with these small numbers, but 14 female athletes that play ringette. And I have never, ever in my life heard of ringette, but apparently it's like ice hockey. But anyway, what they did, they took these 14 women and had them do 2 bouts of exercise on an exercise bike, cycling, one at what was called moderate intensity and one which was called intense activity. And they measured all kinds of parameters, oxygen uptake, lactate, things like this, VO2 max. And surprisingly, despite the fact I just said it might improve your workouts by vasodilation, the nitric oxide, for 4 of the 14, their VO2 max, basically, which is the amount of oxygen that your body uses in exercise, the higher your VO2 max, the better your cardiovascular fitness. But for 4 of the 14, it actually dropped a little bit. But here was the benefit, and this is what I think is fascinating. All 14 significantly reduced ratings. They had to rate how they felt the exercise went. Significantly better in terms of perceived exertion, both at moderate and intense activities. Basically, it didn't seem like they were working as hard. The same level of exertion, same speeds, all of that, felt like they were working less. They were having to put less into it if they did 5 ounces of beet juice before their workout. So can you imagine going out for a run, going to the gym, and working out's hard. That's one of the reasons so many people don't do it. But they drank something that actually made it feel like they weren't working as hard. And I've got another solution for that at the end of this show, at least for runners. But beet juice may be the way to go. Now, one of the keys with that, I was just talking about that with somebody earlier this morning. It would have to be, in my mind, beet juice that is not loaded with sugar. I think that would defeat the purpose of working out and the healthy benefits. And so that gets to how good can a beet juice taste if there's nothing sweet in it. I don't know, but that's something to think about. That would be an interesting thing to try before your workout. Here's something you might try after a workout. There's a new study. It was published in the journal Advances in Nutrition. 100% orange juice might be good for decreasing or fighting inflammation and oxidative stress. And we've talked about oxidative stress. You do all this work or eat all this bad food or do alcohol, smoking, whatever, your body releases these free radicals, the reactive oxygen species that are damaging to tissue. And so you need your body to detoxify all that. Well, it may be that orange juice can do this. Now, the study was funded by a grant from the Florida Department of Citrus. And I've told you multiple times, you do have to be leery of any kind of study that's funded by whatever's being studied. But it says unrestricted grant, so maybe there was no restriction on what they were supposed to study. I don't know. It's just something to think about. But what they found is that 100% orange juice reduces interleukin 6. And interleukin 6, in my world, I know that well, the orthopedic world, interleukin 6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, the interleukin 1 beta, there's a number of these inflammatory markers that actually are damaging to cartilage. They're degradative enzymes that can break down articular cartilage. Well, 100% orange juice significantly reduced interleukin 6 and 2 other markers of inflammation and oxidative stress, so potentially really good. It also had, and I thought the benefit was going to be high in vitamin C, right? It's an antioxidant, and that's certainly good. But what it was is that the 100% orange juice, and I keep saying that because, well, I'll tell you why in a second. But what it also had is something called Hesperidin, which is a compound that's found in oranges and 100% orange juice that is felt to be very good at lowering inflammation and oxidative stress. Now, this is, again, it's a small study funded by Florida Department of Citrus, so we need more data on this to say where this fits in. But the reason I bring this up is, one, if you're going to start drinking orange juice, this is not those orange flavored drinks. You want one that is 100% orange juice. So it's oranges and water, and that's all that's in it. No sugar, no artificial sweeteners, nothing. But then it gets to the, when would you drink? Is it carbs? I've never been a huge fan of drinking your calories, especially fruit juices and that kind of thing. But this may actually have some benefit. Might be something you think about right after a workout. When your insulin sensitivities are real high, the workouts help you sort of use the carbs where they don't get turned into fat. It's something potentially really interesting. So maybe small glasses of 100% orange juice after your workout. Maybe the beet juice before the workout. All right. Speaking of foods and health and what I love, which is longevity and ways to live longer, there was a recent study in the journal Circulation, which is the journal of the American Heart Association, looking at your diet. And what type of diet can help you live longer? What type of diet could kill you earlier? And they talked about the Western diet, which is processed meats. It is refined sugars in all those processed foods and fatty red meats, and then compared it to essentially a Mediterranean diet, legumes, whole grains, fish, vegetables. And the Western diet, probably not surprising, 21% increased risk of mortality, 22% higher risk of cardiovascular disease. So again, Western diet, the processed foods, the refined sugars, the prepackaged processed meats, the fatty ground beefs and red meats, potentially not good for your longevity. Well, there was a study done, and I've talked about this before, what's called blue zones. And there's a book about this. There's multiple books based off this, and there's websites and all this kind of stuff. Blue zones was a study of 9 places in the world, I think it was 9, where a high percentage of people in those areas lived to 100 years old. The only one in the United States was Loma Linda, California, but there was somewhere in Costa Rica, there was Sardinia, there was Okinawa, Japan, there were places all over the world, and they looked at why those people lived to 100 years old. Some of it was physical, like exercise. Some of it was certain things they ate. Some of it was social, like spending time with friends on a regular basis. Well, one of the food groups that seemed to be very popular in multiple of those blue zone locations was beans. And beans potentially could help you live to 100 years old. And so why beans, right? High in protein, high in fiber, with almost no sugar or fat. 1 cup of black beans, 15 grams of protein. That's crazy. 15 grams of fiber, less than 1 gram of fat, less than 1 gram of sugar. Well, that sounds great, but what does that translate into? Well, a study showed that if you eat beans every day, lower risk of high blood pressure, lower risk of dementia, lower risk of diabetes, lower risk of depression. So not just physical health, but mental health. But one of the other things that beans were thought to have were, and it's not just black beans, red beans, pinto beans, kidney beans, high in polyphenols, which lower inflammation. Again, inflammation. You're going to hear on this show over and over and over again, inflammation is one of the biggest factors that hurt our health, systemic inflammation. Some inflammation can be good to help tissues heal short term, but chronic inflammation, very, very bad for so many reasons. Polyphenols lower inflammation and can be involved in healthy aging. So, and I know what you're thinking because I've had this thought too. Beans are carbs. And that's true, but they're not the simple sugars, like white rice and a number of things, potatoes that spike your blood sugar, but aren't really low sustained carbs. These are complex carbs, might be a much better alternative. If you're trying to add some carbs, and in this case, fiber and protein, it might be a good way to go. All right, let's pivot a little bit. I've mentioned on this show multiple times that I have issues with my sleep. I fall asleep pretty well most nights, but I really struggle staying asleep. Not so last night, but the night before, woke up at 1:15, tried, podcast, listen to, would fall asleep for a few minutes, wake right back up, and basically said, forget it, I'm just going to go ahead and get up. I struggle to stay asleep. But more people tend to have trouble falling asleep, but they're both kind of symptoms of insomnia. Well, a new study published in the journal Frontiers in Psychology say that the amount of exercise you do every day may play a role in your ability to fall asleep. Now the question is it getting too little? That was my first thought. It's just people that don't exercise, overweight, obese, lethargic, they just don't sleep as well. But it may not just be exercising too little. It may be exercising too much. This was a study out of Russia. They had 4,800 people and they quantified their workload throughout the day. Not just exercise, but sports and also the physical work they did on their job. And they put people into categories high physical load and on down. And what they found, it won't surprise you that the people that got very little physical activity had problems with insomnia. I mean, I want you to exercise, so we're not going to spend a lot of time to talk about that. But people that were high physical activity loads, significantly more likely to have sleep problems generally, more likely to use sleep medications, and much more likely to have problems falling asleep, especially if they had high physical load 6 days out of 7, 6 days a week. Different study, but along the same lines, looked at over 9,000 adults. And if you're somewhere either less than 10 minutes of exercise a week or over 300 minutes of exercise a week, you're much more likely to have insomnia. Now, I wish I had a good explanation for this. I really don't. It may be along the lines of what we talked about a few weeks ago about exercise and longevity, and there seems to be sort of a plateau 10,000 steps a day or 7 to 10 hours of exercise a week, that above that you actually see the benefits in terms of longevity drop. I don't know. It's kind of an interesting thing. I am probably in that 300 and more minutes of exercise a week, and maybe that's part of my problem. I'm not going to blame it just on that. I got other issues for sure. But that is an interesting thought. So if you are training for a marathon or doing a lot of training and you're struggling to sleep, keep that in the back of your mind. All right, in the seemingly crazy story of the week, I saw this, and I don't know what to make of this. I am a big believer in psychology and psychiatry and what they do, the therapists to help people with mental health issues and psychiatric conditions, all for it. I don't know how much I buy into it for animals, quite honestly. There's a new study, where was this published? Translational Psychiatry, that found that dogs, man's best friend, can develop ADHD, or a condition essentially like ADHD, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention. To me, that's a lot of dogs, quite honestly, and I wouldn't think that that's some sort of psychiatric condition, but apparently it does matter in terms, there's some factors that can lead to that. One, puppies more likely to have this ADHD-like thing. Male dogs more likely to have this. And then here's where we get involved as pet owners. Dogs that don't get enough attention. Dogs that stay home alone a lot. And dogs that don't get enough exercise. So, if you have a dog, you might think about getting a female dog, kind of get them through the puppy phases and then make sure they get enough exercise, spend time at home with them, give them plenty of attention. Even crazier, apparently, is dogs can get OCD, Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. And this is what this article says, that tail chasing, continuously licking themselves are examples of OCD. I don't know. Call me skeptical. I'm not a veterinarian, and I think veterinarians are great. I think it would be tons of fun to be a veterinarian. I am very skeptical. How do you know the dogs can't talk to you? Like, what kind of, I don't know. The whole thing doesn't make sense to me. All right, and then back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier about ways to make your exercise, make your workout not seem so bad. When I was running, I've talked on this show before that I ran for, 8, 10 years maybe, every single day, just about every day. I loved running. But I got through medical school, running was one of my types of exercise. But then I started my residency, Campbell Clinic, orthopedic surgery, and I started cut back. Now, part of that was Memphis. It was super hot. It was just brutal. And part of it was lack of time. But then, and I tell people this all the time, I quit running because I got tired of hearing myself think. And I was unfortunate enough to basically say, all right, I'm done running. And I don't mean sprints. I still do sprints, but I'm talking about 3-mile runs, 5-mile runs, things like that. I was unfortunate enough to run before the iPod was made, or certainly the iPhone. Now, I did try to use music. I actually had a Sony Walkman. If you're under 30, you have no idea what I'm talking about, a Sony Walkman, but had the little cassette tapes and the over-the-ear, the earbuds would stick in your ear, but it was like a metal frame on top of your head. And that's what I did. And it was basically to give me something to sort of focus on instead of my running. And I remember talking to a running coach years ago about the iPod and how I'm sure it makes running so much easier. And he was adamantly opposed to the iPod and listening to music when you ran. He wanted you to focus on your form and make sure you were landing a certain way and all of this. Here's the thing. That actually may be horrible advice. There was a new study that was published in the, Journal of Motor Learning and Development. Researchers at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and actually Iranian researchers, wanted to see what was made running the easiest. And so you can look at this two ways. You can look at it at elite runners that are trying to perform a little bit better, but for most of us, it's just trying to go for a run every day for our overall health. What would make that easier to do? And so they wanted to test what's called the constrained action hypothesis. Basically, it's that our bodies know our movements better than our brains do, and if we actually have to think about it, we're going to do it worse. It's the idea, high-level soccer players, if you give them a soccer ball and put some cones out and ask them to dribble through it, they actually do it better when they're not really paying attention to exactly where their foot lands and how they push off and things like that. If they start thinking about it, their performance worse. Same thing with PGA golfers, elite golfers. If you just have them putt, they don't really think about it, they do really well. But if you make them think about exactly their hand position and their arm position and all of that, they actually get a little bit worse. So the thought here with running was, well, let's see what actually makes running easier. Not just easier, but just helps them do better. So they took 12 young women, and apparently in Iran, you can't do a study of both men and women. I'm sure it's religious and otherwise. But so there's just women in the study, and these were not elite marathoners or anything like that. These were just physically active women that did run some, but again, not super gung-ho on running. They had them run 6 minutes at a time, 70% of their top speed. They had measured that ahead of time in 4 different circumstances. So one time that they did that 6-minute run, they had to focus on their feet and the muscles in the feet. That's all they could think about. Second time, they had to count their steps. So they're still focusing on their feet, but in a little different way. Third time, they had to count backwards by 3 during that 6-minute run. So they were focusing using their brains, but not focusing on part of their body. And then the fourth time, they got to run while watching video of a basketball game. Now, just mentally ask yourself what you think is going to come of that in terms of perceived exertion, in terms of lactate production, in terms of oxygen consumption, which is going to be best. And it gets back to that running coach I talked to. He says that music is really, really not helpful. Well, that is not what this study showed. They showed that by far watching a video was best. 1, they consumed the least oxygen. 2, they produced the least lactate, meaning they just basically weren't working as hard, even though they were running, doing this same physical output. And most of all, had the least amount of perceived exertion, meaning they got through it and they didn't feel like they had worked as hard, even though it was working just as hard. Distraction was a good thing. So, back to the iPod, back to the iPhone, back to however you want to distract yourself. If you just hate working out, that music is a good thing. Maybe if you're on a treadmill, you can actually watch something. You know, whether it's a podcast or music that you're listening to, all of that is good. And again, for the elite runners, maybe there is some benefit to, I don't know, some of that. There's some benefit to focusing on landing on a certain, on the balls of your feet, or I honestly doubt it. I really feel like if you can get, and it doesn't have to be some external thing. It could be just thinking about something at work, or, but something that's not focusing on your feet or the pain that you're having or something like that could be very, very good for you. All right, that is going to wrap up today's show. Very, very excited. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that if you have any. Remember, on Friday, Ask Dr. Geier will be all of Better Than Ever Live. Friday, noon Eastern Time. We'll be back Thursday talking about a lot of good stuff. We're going to talk about Halloween-related stuff Thursday. We're going to talk about being safe for Halloween, being healthy for Halloween, and we're going to talk about why you should potentially go to haunted houses. Enzo, I distract myself by looking at a specific point in front of me and pushing myself to pass it as I go on. I love the videos. Really appreciate that, Enzo. You know what's funny about that, Enzo, is I actually, when I ran, I went to college at Wake Forest in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and the average student could actually run on the cross-country course. When I was there, they had a great cross-country team, and it's through these trails, and it was wood. It was fantastic. It's a 3.1 mile 5K course. And I did the exact same thing. I would see a tree in the distance and focus on just getting to that tree. And it really worked for me. I am all for it. Because I do remember in college, I took of all things, one of my PE classes was running. Complete waste from like needing to learn anything, but really interesting in learning sort of the techniques and the science behind running. And I remember the girl was having that ran the course, the grad student was having me focus on running on the front of my feet, not lifting my feet, and it drove me bananas when I was focusing on that because I would wear out really quickly. So Enzo, I absolutely love that. All right, remember Friday, Ask Dr. Geier. Thursday, 2 days from now, lots of Halloween stuff, lots of health, wellness, nutrition, exercise, lots of other good stuff like that. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will see you right back here in 2 days.